Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen, and please seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, joining us today are a number of guests of the member for Edmonton-Glenora from the Educational Policy Studies Graduate Students Association. Please welcome them to the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable, the member for Edmonton, Beverly Clairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The Fair Deal panel is a giant distraction, and Albertans aren't buying it writ large. But if there's one element of truth in that report, it's this: the urgent need to diversify the economy. The report was a scathing indictment of this government's failed economic development strategy. The report states the obvious. Economic diversification has long been a priority for Albertans, and I couldn't agree more. But our current Minister of Finance forcefully disagrees. He's famous for calling economic diversification a long-term luxury that his government simply could not afford. The report calls for investments in tech, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And it expresses the frustration of thousands of entrepreneurs who saw the tax credits and other investments in technology gutted by this government. The report goes on. It recommends that Alberta pursue a research and innovation agenda to diversify Alberta's economy. What a novel idea. It's the same idea that was operationalized by our previous NDP government and eviscerated by this current UCP government. With the economy on its knees, this government is gutting our post-secondary education system, the primary drivers of knowledge, ideas, expertise, and innovation in our economy. On this side of the House, we see our post-secondary education system as one of our greatest strategic assets, a huge comparative advantage and a driver of economic diversification and job creation. But on that side of the House, that government sees our world-leading institutions and drivers of innovations as a toxic liability, an irritant, something to be gutted, downsized, turned into the shell of its former self. There is one clear call to action in the Fair Deal panel report that we can all support. This government needs to drop their destructive economic agenda that led to 50,000 job losses and put economic diversification at the front burner of their agenda. Economic diversification isn't a long-term luxury. It's critical to the future of our province, and it's time this government got the message and clued in.
I was going to say it's nice to hear your voice. And it is. The Honourable Member for Peace River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, our government released the Fair Deal panel report, something Albertans were excited to see. I want to thank the members of the Fair Deal panel for all the work that they did and the town halls that they hosted, and I myself participated in one in Peace River, and it was incredibly valuable for my constituents to be able to speak. I also want to take this minute to remember Chief Jason Goodstriker, who sadly passed away while he was serving on the panel. Mr. Speaker, the Fair Deal panel and the work that they did is incredibly important to Albertans because Albertans have told us over and over again that this is something that matters to them, including in the last provincial and federal election. I want to provide some clarity, as the panel did, Mr. Speaker, about what Albertans expect. Albertans expect to be treated fairly. They expect not to get some sort of special deal. They expect respect and fair treatment owed to every member of Confederation. Unfortunately, for too long, Ottawa has neglected its duty, and Albertans been doing its duty for Confederation and our country. It's time Ottawa listened back. In part, this is why our government was elected. Alberta wanted a strong voice to advocate for our province. Our government will pursue these recommendations of the Fair Deal panel, and that's exactly what Albertans expect of us. We will assert our constitutional jurisdiction. We will not accept indifference or interference from Ottawa in our jurisdiction. And unfortunately, there are some, Mr. Speaker, including the member from Edmonton, Beverly Clearview, and the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition, who believe that standing up for our province and forcing these issues is, quote, a distraction. Mr. Speaker, shameful. To be perfectly clear, Fair Deal is not a distraction. Listening to my constituents and Albertans is not a distraction. Ignoring this issue is not acting responsibly, it's acting like federal liberals, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Fish Creek.
Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that Albertans have faced unprecedented challenges and uncertainty over the last few months. As we move through stage 2 of Alberta's aggressive relaunch strategy and look towards the future, I would like to talk about the other relaunch which is so important to our great province, the relaunch of the Alberta Advantage. Albertans are by nature resilient, ambitious, and optimistic. This resilience has been clearly demonstrated throughout our short but storied history, but arguably it is proving to be even more pronounced as we work together responsibly and with compassion in facing this global pandemic. Our lives have been impacted beyond most of our wildest imaginations. Jobs have been lost, businesses closed, and Albertans are rightly worried about providing for their families. As Albertans cope with the realities of COVID-19, there are two enduring qualities that have not been lost: hope and Alberta's renowned community spirit. Albertans have faced more than our fair share of challenges in recent years, from economic downturn and the ravages of COVID-19 to floods, fires, and hailstorms of almost biblical proportions. But through it all, Albertans have faced these challenges with notable resolve, resiliency, and compassion. And that is why I rise today, Mr. Speaker. I rise to commend Albertans and showcase their indomitable spirit. We are a province of risk-takers, hard workers, and dreamers. Our deep-rooted entrepreneurial spirit, can-do attitude, and prairie work ethic set us apart as proof of a notion fondly referred to and roundly heralded as the Alberta Advantage. We are a province that doesn't bow our heads when times get tough, but instead embrace adversity with rigor and optimism. So, Mr. Speaker, I proudly commend Albertans for their entrepreneurial and resilient spirit in the face of this global pandemic. Despite the trials that face our industries, our livelihoods, and our way of life, Albertans will overcome. And though we're not yet out of the woods, I am confident that Albertans will prevail as we focus our ambitions, our determination on a return to the Alberta Advantage, not only as a badge of honour, but as a source of pride and achievement for generations to come. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Albertans likely don't know that the Government of Alberta is actually a service provider for some of the most medically fragile, complex, disabled children and adults in this province. I'm talking about people with disabilities who may be receiving palliative care, use ventilators, fed by G-tubes, are nonverbal, use wheelchairs, and are certainly at high risk for COVID-19. The programs include Rosecrest and Hardesty in Edmonton, which house and support medically fragile children full-time and provide respite care for families. Also included are graduated supports in Calgary and RSS in Edmonton, which support disabled adults with complex medical needs. The staff at these programs are highly skilled and have worked at these programs for decades. Low staff turnover and intimate knowledge of the people they support is in part what makes these programs so unique and responsive. These employees are public sector workers, so they are paid a little more than what private and nonprofit operators can pay. They have better access to training and benefits. A few weeks ago, all of the staff, families and guardians received 90-day notice from the UCP government, notice that these programs were targeted for possible transition to other service providers. What that means is if the government proceeds, these programs, as they are now, will be put up for bid, privatized. Why would the government risk the lives and well-being of medically fragile children and adults? Why is the UCP willing to risk their health by introducing unknowns? Why is the UCP willing to do this in the middle of a pandemic? Changing these supports will pose huge, unnecessary risks to disabled children and adults. These changes will add pressures to acute care facilities like the Stollery, where several children are already housed and cared for because intake at Rosecrest was stopped before COVID. It is my sincere hope that the UCP will set aside their ideological attacks on the public service and these dangerous budget cuts. Stop them before it's too late.
The honourable member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the grads of 2020, congratulations. Whether you went to Spruce Grove Composite High School, Stony Plain Memorial, St. Peter the Apostle, St. Teresa Outreach, or Living Waters Christian Academy, or through an alternative method such as homeschooling, you have hit what will be one of the biggest milestones of your life. For the first time in most of your lives, where you go is really up to you. Whether you choose to attend university, study a trade like I did, head directly into the workforce, or simply take some time to determine where you want to head next, the choice is up to you, and the decisions you make will have effects on you for the rest of your life. For some, this will mean uprooting your life and moving elsewhere. For others, very little will change. This is a graduating class that managed their grade 12 year while dealing with the impacts of a global pandemic uprooting life as we know it. This is a graduating class that has handled tremendous adversity with adaptability, perseverance, and patience. For this class, this year doesn't look like what they expected and have looked forward to. For many, this is incredibly disappointing after years of hard work to graduate from high school. While it isn't the scenario anyone wanted for you, these lessons will prove invaluable in the future. I fully believe that the graduating class of 2020 will produce some of the most incredible innovators, leaders, and community-centric individuals our province has ever seen. To that class, I wish you the best in whatever your next steps will be. I hope that your experiences will inform the way you see the world. I hope that you take what has been unfortunate circumstances and take them as opportunities to learn and grow. To the graduates of 2020, I can't wait to see how you change the world. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Glenora, has a statement to make.
I'm glad that the galleries in the Legislature building have been reopened to the public, and my first guests since they've been reopened are Avraj and Benazir, who are here today to see me table a petition and a summary that they wrote and gathered signatures for. They are graduate students in the Department of Educational Policy Studies, of which I am a proud alumna as well. They are here because they have been devastated by the cuts to post-secondary institutions imposed by the current Premier and the UCP. One of the impacts is the closure of the H.T. Coots Library, which many refer to as the Education Library at the U of A. Every teacher trained at the U of A has spent some time in the Coots Library. It's a tremendous asset for curricular supports and education-specific research. The library is a gathering space in the same building as most education classes, which is especially important for students with mobility challenges. Because it is rich with age-appropriate K-12 resources, it is also one of the places on campus where you'll see children, parents, and childcare workers gather together. These students know this closure sends a message to Albertans about the lack of value the UCP places on education, research, and public supports for learning. I also want to inform the House of a loss to the Faculty of Education. Earlier this week, Dr. Jerry Katcher passed away suddenly. I met Dr. Katcher in Ed Policy Studies 360, Society and Education. He was an excellent storyteller, and he helped me think about who our students are and that they can't leave their identities at the door of a classroom. He also helped me examine my privilege. He was the first person to suggest that I do a master's degree. He wrote me a letter of recommendation, and when I told him I wanted to run for office, he also wrote me a check. He helped me on this path, and for that I will forever be grateful. In 360, he told us that more of us would not be teaching than would be in 10 years. He's right. We need to keep fighting for a new government that respects teachers, supports students, and acknowledges that we all bring experiences with us to the classroom. Thank you for teaching me that, Jerry.
The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend is Father's Day, a time when Albertans will pause to celebrate the men closest to them in their lives. I have many titles, but father is the most noble and honourable that I proudly wear. That's because nothing is more fulfilling to me than being a dad. To me, being a father is more than just sharing DNA with somebody. It's sharing time, advice, compassion, and unconditional love. When I reflect on moments like these, it's hard not to think about the strong male role models in my own life, like my grandfathers, Jack Harker and Paul Scow, my brothers, David, John, and Jordan, my in-laws, Manuel, Jim, and Grandpa Cease, and of course, most notably, my own father, George Sidney Scow. When I was writing this, I thought, what would my dad want me to say about him? And the answer is nothing, because he's a man of very few words, but one of action. He taught me by example to be honest, to be faithful, diligent, loyal, self-sacrificing, and of course, how to shoot a sweet 15-foot jump shot. Now, I don't think anybody in this chamber would say I'm a man of few words like my dad. But these lessons and so many others have molded me into the man that I am today. And when I became a father on May 9th, 2014, I promised myself I would pass these same lessons on to my kids, including the jump shot. So while we're preparing to celebrate the men in our lives and thinking of that perfect gift to buy them, like a power tool or an ugly tie, stop. Pick up the phone and call. Drop by for a visit. Give your father the most precious gift you have, that of time. The fathers in our lives only ask for our time so they can admire the amazing people that we have become today. Mr. Speaker, I know that you're a father. So to you, the newest father in this chamber, member from Edmonton, Beverly Clareview, other fathers in this chamber, and fathers across the province, and of course to my own dad, George Scow, have a happy and healthy Father's Day.
The Honourable Member for Banff Kananaskis.
Mr. Speaker, just weeks after we saw the NDP supporter and confidant Gil McGowan refer to the parents of religious students as nut bars, which for the record we've never heard a denial of, our angry opposition is at it again. Last night, during discussion of Bill 15, the Choice in Education Act, the member for Edmonton-Rutherford made the claim that First Nations people in Alberta are worried the enhancement of charter schools in Alberta is not dissimilar to the promotion of residential schools. Mr. Speaker, can we let those words just sink in for a moment? The program of residential schools in Canada is one of the darkest moments in our history, and I can say with full confidence that it is not something that any member in this House is proud of. First Nations and Métis people were ripped from their homes, cultures, and families in a misguided and disillusioned step to assimilate them. It was wrong. So to have a member of this House stand up and proclaim that a charter school, defined by the Alberta government as an autonomous, non-profit public school, is somehow similar to residential schools is disgusting beyond comparison. What matters here is the continued attacks from this member on the hard work this government and our Minister of Indigenous Relations does every day to stand up for the First Peoples of our province. From his work on the creation of the AIOC, the litigation fund, the Red Dress and Sisters in Spirit Declaration, protocol signings, and other efforts, the work of this government is doing speaks for itself. It's about reconciliation. We drew a line in the sand about being allies, and we followed up on it. Back to charter schools, I can tell you that members of the Paul First Nation see value in charter schools. Dozens of their children attend this school. It lies on their traditional territory and offers teachings based on Mother Earth in a setting and environment that parents and children are comfortable with. These people see value in Mother Earth's charter school, and our government is proud to offer that choice. So, Mr. Speaker, the members on this side of the House, unlike the members opposite, stand by parents who value choice education, including First Nations parents who want to give their children a traditional upbringing in a charter school.
Leduc Bowman has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic seemingly came out of nowhere and quickly spread. It affected the health of millions of people across the globe and caused the deaths of tens of thousands. Albertans needed a government that was ready to respond, and that's what it did. Alberta health officials had the foresight in early January to start ordering PPE for our frontline workers. When the first public health order was implemented, it was implemented swiftly to ensure that many Albertans would be protected. The government also increased funding for our health care by $500 million and made changes to allow for virtual doctor's appointments. An additional $170 million was allocated to support long-term care facilities in our province, and another $53 million for mental health supports. We had the ability to test more than any other jurisdiction in Canada. Though this may have resulted in a higher case count, it helped Albertans get a better image of the spread of the virus. In Alberta, the pandemic was not just a public health concern, but also a major economic threat. When the economy was partly shut down, the government kept 85% of businesses open, representing roughly 85% of the workforce and 96% of the economy. As we accelerate the relaunch with last week's Stage 2 announcement, more businesses are reopening, providing Albertans with access to services they've long been waiting for. Some businesses and services like pools, gyms, and other rec facilities have been accelerated from Stage 3. Gathering limits have been increased, allowing people to attend important family events like weddings and funerals, and increased attendance for places of worship. Albertans have done a fantastic job keeping the numbers low during Stage 1, which allowed the government to accelerate Stage 2. Life in Alberta is getting closer to normal, but there is still more work to be done, and we need to remain vigilant and look out for one another. Your actions in keeping yourself healthy are not just for you, they are also for your family, your community, and for all Albertans.
reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions.
Honourable members, it is now 1:50 and it's time for oral question period. And the Leader of Her Majesty's Official Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In September 2017, the Premier was, quote, crystal clear. He said the UCP wouldn't scare hundreds of thousands of Albertans by talking about cutting their wages. Quote, funnily enough, I just met Restaurants Canada who, like me, oppose the increase but believe that rolling it back is a complete non-starter. I guess the real non-starter was being honest with Albertans about rolling it back. Premier, if you won't commit to protecting the minimum wage here and now, and I beg you to do that, will you at least apologize for the fact that the UCP lied to Albertans in the last election?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know she would like us to apologize for defeating the NDP in the last election, but we're just not going to do that. I know she's still angry with Albertans for firing her as the first failed Premier in Alberta history to lose after just one term. But, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the minimum wage, the question is answered in our platform, black in white. Hear, hear.
Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here are some real facts. From October 2015 to August 2018, sales jobs went up, retail trade jobs went up, restaurant receipts went up. You know what didn't go up? Child poverty. 40,000 children in this province lifted out of poverty during that time because of a minimum wage. On what planet does this Premier think cutting the wages of their parents, 120,000 of them, is a good idea?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the NDP continues to live in complete denial about the jobs crisis she created. She and her NDP government drove this province into the most protracted period of economic stagnation in its history since the 1930s, Mr. Speaker. In part, yes, because they killed tens of thousands of jobs for vulnerable people, entry-level people, folks at the margins of the labour market, young people and single moms whose jobs were taken away by a 50% increase in wage rates in the middle of a recession. They were wrong to do so. That's why we're working to get the economy back on track.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The robbery is going to take place by the party that lied to them before the last election. Now, the Labour Market Information Council says Canadians working in the lowest paid occupations have been the hardest hit by COVID-19. Yet these are the same folks who were the heroes we relied on. They went to work every day to make sure we all got toilet paper. Now, this Premier wants them to pay for his complete, failed, and inability to provide economic stimulus. Not only will this not work, it is cruel and unfair. Why is this Premier so committed to being cruel and unfair?
The Honourable the Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, when you listen to absurd, ridiculous, nasty questions like that, it's almost like the NDP actually lives in the angry echo chamber of left-wing Twitter or something. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what, in the real world, there is an economic crisis in this province, in part precipitated by the massive tax hikes and anti-growth policies of the NDP. And we are working double time to undo the damage which left 180,000 Albertans out of work, which drove youth unemployment up to unprecedented levels, Mr. Speaker. We're cleaning up their mess.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier goes on and on about what he sees as the benefits of an Alberta pension plan. What he doesn't tell Albertans is the cost. The Fair Deal panel says that Alberta's share of the CPP is between $40 and $70 billion. Even taking a rough estimate of $55 billion, creating an Alberta pension plan means Albertans could miss out on as much as $13.5 billion of CPP growth in just the first 5 years. I'm talking about those investment returns the Premier called unimportant last week. Premier, are you only doing this to get back at your former political opponents in Ottawa? Should Albertans really pay for your massive score?
The Honourable the Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, this is a new NDP tactic, actually openly admitting their basic economic illiteracy. Mr. Speaker, we are going to do an exhaustive study on the costs, benefits, and structure of a potential Alberta pension plan because we believe Albertans are every bit as capable as Quebecers or the federal government in managing a public pension plan. But here's the fundamental difference. With the youngest population in the country, the former Premier's angry. She's heckling, Mr. Speaker. We would save Albertans $3 billion a year by having a provincial pension.
The order, the honourable member for Edmonton Millwoods.
The Premier didn't trust teachers to manage their pension. Quote, "There's nothing in it for the Alberta taxpayer, so it's pure spite. I think it's important that people understand there's a difference between bluster and hard economic analysis," end quote. Mr. Speaker, that's Keith Ambachir, Director Emeritus of the International Centre for Pension Management. He's one of Canada's foremost pension experts. He studied the Premier's plan and concluded it would mean hundreds of millions in startup costs, assuming liabilities, underwriting risks, in the neighbourhood of $180 billion. Why is the Premier not telling Albertans about the costs or listening to their voices?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're going to study. Unlike the NDP, which loves having Justin Trudeau manage Alberta's pensions, unlike the NDP that wants to write Justin Trudeau a blank check when it comes to our pensions, Albertans want us to look at the potential costs. Oh, Mr. Speaker, the NDP leader, she's heckling. She's angry. She's angry that we want potentially to repatriate $3 billion a year that we're sending to the rest of the country through the CPP. We owe it to Albertans, Mr. Speaker, to do a serious study, to be transparent about it, and if the net benefits are there, we'll put it to a vote, and Albertans, not the NDP, will decide. Here.
Order. The Speaker does need to be able to hear the answer. I encourage members of the House to allow that to happen. The Honourable, the member for Edmonton Millwood.
The priority for this Premier is talking about his political opponents. In the Premier's Fair Deal panel report, the government's own public opinion research shows the majority of Albertans do not want him to take Albertans out of the CPP. 26,000 Albertans have signed my petition at handsoffmycpp.ca, telling this Premier to keep his hands off their CPP. And the number is growing by the minute, Mr. Speaker. I have 1,800 people who want to speak to the committee about Bill 203 next week. To the Premier, who exactly are you listening to? Because it's certainly not Albertans.
The Honourable the Premier.
That's exactly who we're listening to, Mr. Speaker. We appointed the Fair Deal panel to listen broadly to Albertans. The Fair Deal panel recommended that we proceed with the provincial pension plan, but this is a matter of great complexity. It requires a detailed and exhaustive analysis, which the Department of Finance and Treasury Board will engage in over the months to come. The report will be released on the prospective cost, benefits, and structure of potential Alberta pension plan to do what Quebec has done successfully for 5 decades. I know the NDP thinks that Quebec can do better than what Alberta can do. I don't share their pessimism about this province. I believe in Albertans, and I believe that we can be masters of our own destiny.
The Honourable member for St. Albert.
Rosecrest is a unique place that cares for medically fragile disabled children from 2 to 18. The 17 kids who live there are nonverbal, use wheelchairs, need ventilators, and some receive palliative care. There are 50 other children that receive respite care. Physicians treating these children point to the outstanding care provided by the staff at Rosecrest as vital to their well-being and the prevention of hospitalization. Premier, why did families and guardians get 90-day notice that the UCP would be exploring other service delivery models for them? What's the plan?
The Honourable the Premier has risen.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Government of Alberta provides funding for agencies all over the province that care for adults and children with disabilities. We invest over nearly $1.4 billion per year in care for adults and kids with disabilities. 90% of those services are done by community partners. We've a well-established system that's delivering services every day, and the civil society partners, including charities and nonprofits, who we do fund, do a commendable job of caring for people with disabilities. Certainly, the member can attest to this, as she worked with one of those providers for 15 years, I understand.
Honourable member for St. Albert.
Yes, she can. They're paid a lot less, that's why. Hardesty Home is another unique place that provides essential respite services for kids with complex needs. Hardesty is able to care for 5 to 6 children at a time, and families book 3 months in advance. Families report that using respite allows them to keep their kids at home. Premier, Why did the families who need these respite services get 90 days notice, 90 days, that your government plans to change the way services are delivered?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I don't understand what the member has against nonprofits and charities being partners with government in delivering services to people with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, regardless of which, the NDP leader is heckling again. Boy, she's super angry today, Mr. Speaker. Regardless of which path we choose in the future, these individuals will receive the support and care that they require. We can ensure continuity of service in alignment with the services that are provided every day in this province by civil society partners, including the great charities and nonprofits who do this with heart. We are consulting and we're engaging with the union in accordance with the collective bargaining agreement.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Save the money on the backs of kids.
Let me translate that for you. Yes, the vast majority are delivered by nonprofits and private companies. There's a small piece that is not. They're delivered by public sector workers. These are incredibly medically complex people. They've given 90 days notice during a pandemic, and he's going to just spew about, civil society. Answer the question, what can these families and children expect?
Yeah. The Honourable Premier.
What they can expect is the continued robust support of the government of Alberta, which leads the whole country in support for persons with disabilities. But, Mr. Speaker, they're angry, they're heckling again. Mr. Speaker, the answer is that, their question isn't really about kids with disabilities. Their question is about unions. They think that only unions can deliver the services, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I understand that this is an issue that is very, very passionate to many members in the Assembly, but it is still important that the Speaker can hear the answer. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, they don't care about the answers or civility. And in this instance, their question is not really about the kids with disabilities, it's about the unions. They want a union monopoly. We believe that charities and nonprofits do a fantastic job, and we're taking a look at this. We notified the union per our collective bargaining agreement requirements.
Order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
This UCP government refused to listen to warnings about the escalating COVID-19 outbreak at the Cargill meatpacking plant. They failed to listen to repeated warnings in this House and from the workers themselves. It became the biggest outbreak in North America. More than 1,500 people got sick and 3 people died. After weeks of ducking responsibility, the Minister of Health said yesterday that mistakes were made. Does the Premier agree with his Minister of Health that the government mishandled the deadly outbreak at Cargill?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, again, the NDP are trying to politicize the pandemic and trying to politicize COVID. It's so embarrassing, Mr. Speaker. Their desperation is so rank. Let's go over again where this province has been leaders in response to COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. We have been leaders when it's come to our testing capacity. We've been leaders in our ability to contact trace, and they're so angry that they're screaming at me right now, including the former Premier, Mr. Speaker. We have been leaders in our online self-assessment tool, our real-time case data, Mr. Speaker, our ability to procure over $519 million in personal protective equipment, Mr. Speaker. It makes them so angry.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
The Premier said the legislature was an essential service, so we reduced our numbers. We spread out. We didn't come in if we had a cough. Let me remind the Premier of the risk he forced essential workers at Cargill to take. Thousands of people working elbow to elbow with no mask. Workers were pressured to take their place on the line even when they were coughing and feverish. Workers were sleeping in their cars to try to avoid infecting their families. Those dangerous conditions were not acceptable for the Premier himself and his caucus. Why did he force them upon the workers at Cargill?
Why? The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let's just remind ourselves that right now what's happening is the NDP are attacking our public health officials. Wow. They are attacking the frontline workers who were responding to the pandemic and protecting Albertans. And that's who they are choosing to attack right now, Mr. Speaker. It's disrespectful to those folks who did everything over the last 4 months to make sure that we were protected and we were leaders in this province in our response to the pandemic.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
The Minister of Health said, quote, "We didn't realize realized right away how complex the risks were for those folks at the meat plants, not just for transmission at work, but transmission outside of work. That's a load of garbage, Mr. Speaker. The risks were not complex. They were obvious. The Premier was warned again and again and again the plant was not safe and should have been closed. He understood the risk. He chose to do nothing, and 3 people died. Why won't the Premier admit that his health minister's negligence led to 3 preventable deaths and replace him with someone who recognizes the responsibility to protect health and secure human life?
The Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let's remind ourselves that throughout the pandemic, we've been working with the Chief Medical Officer of Health and her orders when it came to those meatpacking plants as well, and the public health officials throughout the province who worked with the folks on the ground there to be able to work with them to protect the workers there, Mr. Speaker. This is obviously a new virus, and it's been a lot that we as a health system have learned, Mr. Speaker. But again, we throughout this province have been leaders in our response to this pandemic, not just nationally, Mr. Speaker, but internationally, to be able to make sure that our response in Alberta was protecting Albertans and Albertan focused.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Fair Deal panel released their report following the engagement of 40,000 Albertans. They told us that a fair deal for Alberta consists of more autonomy, better representation, and a renewed respect for all provinces and territories. The report recommends 25 ways to ensure Alberta has a stronger voice in Confederation. What action has the government taken to assert our authority in Confederation?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank the member for his good question. Mr. Speaker, the government has accepted 23 of the 25 recommendations of the Fair Deal panel. About half of those we've already taken action on or are fully implemented. And on the other half, we've agreed to move forward on, including further study in areas like a potential police force and a pension plan like Quebec and Ontario have. Mr. Speaker, one immediate measure that we've taken, of course, is our commitment to establish a Chief Firearms Officer for Alberta, because personnel is policy, and we want to ensure that those laws are applied in a common-sense way that reflects the values of Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that the federal government failed to consult with Albertans when introducing an order in council that would spend hundreds of millions of dollars criminalizing law-abiding gun owners, and given that they failed to listen to our advice that they should take measures against the illegal gun smugglers and traffickers who are driving gun violence in Canada, and given the Fair Deal panel made recommendations on these matters, what is the government doing to ensure Alberta has a greater role in the administration of firearms policy to reflect the values and priorities of law-abiding Albertans?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, we gave advice to the Federal Minister of Public Safety as well as the Federal Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker. We asked them, consult broadly, Mr. Speaker. Make sure you're thoughtful in your policies when it comes to firearms. And you know what we got, Mr. Speaker? A half-baked policy that's going to cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's not going to keep our communities safer, Mr. Speaker. We've heard loud and clear from Albertans. They want more Alberta, less Ottawa. That's why we're proud to take decisive action. We're starting the process now, Mr. Speaker, to establish the Chief Firearms Office here in the province of Alberta.
The Honourable Member.
Given that the Fair Deal panel has recommended that the government create an Alberta Police Service to replace the RCMP, and given it would primarily operate in rural Alberta as most cities have their own police forces, and given that Alberta Police Service would be able to be more responsive and accountable to local Alberta communities, and the government has committed to doing work to examine the details of a prospective Alberta Police Service. Minister, can you tell us what work your department will be undertaking in this regard, and when you might be able to provide more details to Albertans on this idea?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did town halls last year. We heard frustration, Mr. Speaker, with how policing is done in rural communities, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that the Fair Deal panel brought this forward, Mr. Speaker. We've accepted the recommendation to do this diligence that needs to be done. It's important work, Mr. Speaker. It's complex. We've tasked my ministry to come back with a report, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to bringing that forward to the public in 2021.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora is rising with a question.
The Fair Deal panel failed to give Albertans a plan to replace the tens of thousands of jobs the Premier lost before the pandemic and the oil crash. The panel's report is a collection of proposals that most Albertans don't want, even according to the government's own polling. The panel also failed to achieve its real purpose, which was to control the separatist fire burning within the UCP. Does the Premier know how reckless he is to fan the flames of separatism just to distract from his own failed record on the economy?
The Honourable, the Premier.
So welcome to the through the looking glass world of the NDP. Here I stand every day restating my unqualified commitment to Canada as a proud patriot, and the NDP calls that fanning the flames of separatism. You know, the problem is this. The Conservatives believe in federalism. We believe in the original vision of the Constitution, with provinces exercising the powers that are properly theirs. Whereas the NDP's vision of the Federation is Alberta acting like a doormat for Ottawa.
The honourable member for Edmonton Glenora.
Good answer. Given that the Premier personally selected the member from Cypress Medicine Hat to serve on the Fair Deal panel, and given that on a Wednesday in a letter to the Premier, that member wrote that the panel's report, quote, cannot and will not adequately address Alberta's place in Confederation. And given the member writes that Albertans are second-class citizens in Canada, he writes explicitly about the need for an independent Alberta, 4 times Premier in the 3-page letter. Did the Premier know that this member was a separatist when he appointed him to the panel? And if he did, how could he be so irresponsible?
The Honourable the Premier.
So, Mr. Speaker, let's go down a trip down memory lane. Perhaps the member for Glenora recalls when a former NDP member of the previous government quit the NDP caucus because of bullying from that member and her leader. Bullying because the NDP government would not allow government MLAs to speak their minds, to raise questions, to reflect the concerns of their constituents, whereas this government and this caucus do permit people to speak their minds and reflect the concerns of their constituents, and we make no apology for being, unlike the NDP, truly democratic. Here.
Given that there's soaring rhetoric in this letter, Premier, given, quote, free people must be willing to act at some point of injustice without rectification to draw a line and make a stand, end quote. And given that this member writes that if Canada doesn't agree to his demands, quote, the majority of my constituents in Cypress Medicine Hat and from across our land have made it clear that we must seek another relationship as a sovereign people, end quote. Will the Premier of Alberta categorically denounce separatism? There is no space to waffle on this one, Premier.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if the member for Glenora, who was accused of bullying an NDP member, for not allowing her to speak her mind, if she wants to have a debate with the member for Cypress Medicine Hat on issues of current public discourse, she's more than welcome to do so. But, Mr. Speaker, what this government is seeking to do is to get a fair deal for Alberta in the Canadian Federation, because we contribute $20 billion net to the rest of the Federation, while other governments seek to block our resources. Mr. Speaker, all we ask for is not a special deal, a fair deal, and we are determined to get it.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the UCP's multi-million-dollar cuts to the University of Alberta forced them to cut 6 athletic teams. This is on top of the University of Lethbridge losing their 2 hockey teams, Augustana Vikings saying that their hockey team could be on the chopping block. Alberta student athletes work incredibly hard and give back to our province in so many ways. We're blowing the whistle on the UCP. How many students will you have to give up their dreams before you reverse your cruel, heartless cuts, Minister?
The Honourable the Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is incorrect. I think the member opposite is forgetting that Canada West has already cancelled about half the season, and furthermore, revenue for the U of A teams and other teams have been affected because of the pandemic. Fundraising abilities have been limited as well. The University of Alberta has cancelled the athletic student fee that they collect in order to fund these activities in response to the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, so he can continue to try to score political points on the back of a pandemic. We're not doing that on this side, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Mr. Speaker, that's absolute nonsense. Given that the U of A explicitly said that folding the teams was a result of this government's cuts, and given that many of these student athletes are left scrambling for what they're going to do in the fall, I think, Mr. Speaker, it's penalty box for this minister. Can he tell the plans that he's going to give to students to work and live in this province, and his recruitment strategy is to destroy this sector with cuts stacked upon more cuts?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, the only ones who are in the penalty box are those members on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Albertans fired them in the last election and sent them there. Mr. Speaker, I don't know why the member opposite is trying to score cheap political points as a result of this pandemic, and we know what their record is as well. Mr. Speaker, they left a post-secondary system with no direction, with no vision and goals. We're working on creating a new vision for post-secondary education because, unlike the members opposite, we believe in setting our students up for success so they can find rewarding careers, Mr. Speaker.
It's my hope that no one has to receive a red card here this afternoon. The Honourable, the member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, you know, given, Mr. Speaker, that cutting 6 teams from the University of Alberta, from the University of Lethbridge is hardly setting up students for success, it's pulling the rug out from underneath them. And given that this sector is also facing historic layoffs on top of shutting down campuses in places like Canmore, Whitecourt, Drayton Valley, Minister, I think that you should be given a game misconduct. How could you possibly justify the damage that you have caused to our post-secondary sector?
The Honourable, the Advanced Education Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is offside on this one, absolutely. No question about it. Mr. Speaker, but all kidding aside, it is essential for our government to ensure that we set our students up for success. Let's remember, under the former government, we saw the highest youth unemployment rate in decades. Every day when I speak to students, their number one concern, Mr. Speaker, is jobs and finding rewarding careers at the end of their studies. That is why we are working with our institutions to build a new vision for the future that, again, will help ensure that our students have the skills and competencies they need to succeed.
The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Lac St. Anne Parkland, we have a number of critical infrastructure transportation corridors contribute greatly to the Albertan economy. However, many repairs are in need of expansion. One such of these is Highway 60 that needs some attention. The section of road between Highway 16 and 16A needs an overpass. An overpass that would greatly enhance economic growth and safety, not only to my constituents, but to those in the greater Edmonton area. To the Minister of Transportation, can you please provide an update on the construction of the Highway 60 overpass?
The Honourable, the Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report that the work to construct an overpass on Highway 60 is moving forward. The project includes the twinning of 4 kilometres of Highway 60 between Highway 16 and 16A. This key piece of infrastructure is part of the government's plan to invest in communities across the province and get Albertans back to work.
For Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for providing that wonderful news. Given the need to move people and products to the major corridors that connect Atchison, Industrial Park, and the greater Edmonton area, and given that the highways are showing their age in regards to the conditions of the asphalt surface currently, the large number of potholes, cracks, and overall rough sections in Highway 16, 16A, and as well as 43, to the Minister, can you advise Albertans when the repairs will take in to restore the vitality, safety, and the overall functionality of these highways in my constituency?
The Minister of Transportation.
Well, it's disappointing to hear the NDP actually heckling a question about infrastructure. I guess they don't like infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. On the other hand, I thank the member for the question. The member will be happy to hear that earlier this month our crews completed patch paving along Highway 16. Again, they're still heckling infrastructure. It's a sad thing. This week, patch paving was completed along Highway 16A as well. In July, crews will be out on all 3 highways completing much-needed maintenance work and fixing the asphalt, whether the NDP likes it or not.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure the Minister it is important to the folks in our constituency and the economy and not a laughing matter, so thank you, sir. Given that so many of my constituents rely on the previously mentioned highways to travel safely from work, and given the relaunch of the economy and the need to restore normalcy for the overall well-being and safety of Albertans, to the same Minister, when can the patient but anxious constituents of mine be able to use the repaired highways previously discussed, which are needed for those constituents waiting to take their driver's tests in Class 5 and below?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have to say that the Honourable Member's constituents aren't patient when they phone my office. Mr. Speaker, the member will be happy to hear that next week Class 5 drivers who have had the road test cancelled because of COVID-19 will then be invited to rebook their tests. We are giving those Albertans first priority as they were in line before this all happened. By the end of the month, road tests will be fully relaunched and available to the members' constituents and Albertans across the province for all licenses of classes, or all classes of licenses, both.
The honourable member for Calgary Buffalo has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin with a riddle. When is a deal not a deal? Answer, when it's with this Premier and his UCP government. Mr. Speaker, a little over 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Transportation stood in this House and said that they will fund the Green Line. But after Calgary City Council voted overwhelmingly to move forward with this project, the Minister now says they are reviewing the Green Line. Why is this government now backing away from funding the Green Line?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member never gets tired of getting it wrong. It's been like that for years. Mr. Speaker, we're consistent in saying that we put money through legislation aside to build the Green Line. We're consistent in saying that that's always been contingent upon the city building essentially what they promised to build when the money was promised, and that's still the case. We're going to work with the city to assist them to make sure that they're building what was promised. We're going to provide assistance for economic planning, for engineering planning. We're here to help, and we look forward to doing that.
The honourable member for Calgary Buffalo.
The only thing the minister is consistent about is confusing the matter. Given the government refuses to give a clear commitment on funding the Green Line, and given this government has already given itself the power to tear up the contract on a whim, and given this government already cut funding to the project by 86% over the next 4 years, and given it says it's now reviewing the funding, to the minister, will you stand in the House today and commit to funding this vital project, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, only the NDP would call it an 86% cut because the money was pushed out a couple of years, which it was. But, Mr. Speaker, the fact is we will do what we said we would do. We will establish that the Green Line will be built for the benefit of Calgarians and all Albertans. We will assure that it will be built in a financially responsible way. We will ensure that it will be built in a way that makes sense from an engineering standpoint. And we'll work with the City of Calgary as we said we would. Nothing has changed, Mr. Speaker, that way.
The honourable member.
Given this government already tried to shut down the Green Line through their wealthy donor proxies, and given the duly elected members of City Council overwhelmingly voted to move ahead with the Green Line in a vote of 14-1, and given that 2/3 of Calgarians support this project, why would this government even consider the idea of not funding the Green Line and override the democratic will of Calgarians?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, I've been fighting for the Green Line since I first was running for office in 1998, and I know that's forever, right? And Mr. Speaker, back then I wanted it built responsibly. I wanted it built for the benefit of Calgarians. I wanted it to be built in a way that, from engineering standpoint, that makes sense. Nothing has changed. Making sure we get good value for Albertans and Calgarians is something that I believe Albertans and Calgarians are in favor of, Mr. Speaker. That's what we intend to do while we work with the City of Calgary on the Green Line project.
The order. The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre is the one with the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doctors in Cold Lake wrote a letter yesterday. Quote, the UCP government unilaterally terminated the contract they have with our representative body, the Alberta Medical Association. This translated to unprecedented cuts across the board for physicians and has a direct impact on patient care and services offered to the community. We are looking at the stark reality of not being able to continue to cover our ER full-time with our expected cohort of physicians, end quote. 3 doctors are leaving Cold Lake. Why does the minister keep saying he's fixed a crisis that still gets worse every day?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is extremely incorrect. If anything, we have increased funding, especially for our rural physicians, Mr. Speaker. And on April 24th, we actually announced our rural action plan, Mr. Speaker, to increase funding by $81 million for our rural physicians. A number of initiatives, including removing the cap on the Rural Remote Northern program, Mr. Speaker, so that our physicians in communities like Cold Lake can be paid more, Mr. Speaker. More money is being paid to those physicians, despite what the honourable member wants to mislead Albertans.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that clearly none of these doctors trust or believe this minister, and given that the City of Cold Lake and the MD of Bonnyville also also put out a joint statement yesterday that said their communities could lose important medical services due to doctor shortages at the Cold Lake Healthcare Centre. And they have called it an acute concern. Quote, "This is not a healthy situation for the doctors or the patients." That's Bonnyville Reeve Greg Sawchuk. I think he's right. Is this Minister of Health planning to close the Cold Lake emergency room after he's chased the doctors out?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I do agree that there are physicians, especially in our rural communities, who do not believe what's happening because they are being misled by the NDP, Mr. Speaker, because they are being given by incorrect information, including incorrect information by that honourable member. It's disrespectful to our physicians, Mr. Speaker. It's disrespectful as well to patients in this province. But we are increasing the amount that we are going to be paying physicians, especially in our rural communities, Mr. Speaker. We are keeping the physician compensation budget at $5.4 billion, the largest amount in the history of this province, and the highest amount on a per capita basis in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that I could table a stack of emails from doctors and people in rural Alberta thanking me for representing their concerns, I doubt the minister can do the same. And given that on Monday I read a letter from the mayor and council in Athabasca about doctors leaving town, and then given today it's Cold Lake, maybe next week we'll hear from Wainwright or Whitecourt about, or another one of these dozens of communities being harmed by the UCP's rural healthcare crisis caused by this minister. Given that he has failed to clean up his own mess, doctors are leaving rural Alberta, and every member of this House knows it. How long will he keep continuing to try to deny it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Again, the NDP are misleading Albertans, Mr. Speaker. It's disrespectful to the patients, disrespectful as well to the physicians who deserve to be told the truth, Mr. Speaker, and in particular, the physicians in Athabasca, Mr. Speaker. I'll talk about Athabasca, and our initiatives that we announced on April 24th included a premium increase of 21%, and the amount that physicians in Athabasca are going to be paid, Mr. Speaker, because our focus is on retention and recruitment in our rural communities, unlike the 4 years under the member for Edmonton Galore, who's yelling at me right now, Mr. Speaker, was ignored it for 4 years, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member, order. The honourable member for Lethbridge East is the only one with the call.
Mr. Speaker, parents and students in my riding were relieved last week when the Minister of Education announced Alberta's school re-entry plan. Since March, our students have been learning from home, which has them missing their social circles and in-person learning. Thankfully, this detailed plan outlines 3 potential scenarios for the upcoming school year, with 2 of the scenarios resulting in students returning to the classroom. Can the Minister of Education please elaborate on these 3 scenarios and explain the likelihood of each one of them?
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to say that we do have a comprehensive school re-entry plan that includes 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, a return to near-normal schooling with some health measures. Scenario 2, a partial return to in-person classes with additional health measures. And Scenario 3, which is the worst-case scenario, at-home learning continues. Mr. Speaker, given the current state of the pandemic, we are targeting Scenario 1. Regardless, continuing at-home learning is extremely unlikely, so parents, teachers, and students can look forward to returning to school for in-person.
The honourable member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given that Scenario 3 is the worst-case scenario, and given that 86% of parents surveyed by the Alberta School Councils Association indicated that they were in favour of a return-to-school plan for K-12 students in September, and given that a final decision will be made no later than August the 1st, can the Minister please explain how the government will choose which school re-entry scenario schools will follow in September?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will follow current public health advice when deciding which re-entry scenario schools will follow in September. We have asked schools to prepare for all 3 scenarios because the state of the pandemic could change at any time. As I've previously stated, based on current health measures, we are targeting Scenario 1. I am looking forward to seeing our students return to the classroom in September and will provide an update on re-entry by no later than August 1st.
The honourable member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Minister. Given that some provinces have not yet released their school re-entry plans, and given that Alberta was one of the first provinces to release an education continuity plan when COVID-19 resulted in cancelled classes, can the Minister please explain how the education system has stepped up to support our students and how they will be prepared to continue supporting them when they return to school in September?
The Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since COVID-19 hit our province, our schools, our teachers, our education staff and our parents have worked tirelessly to ensure our students continue to learn from home, and I want to express my deep, deep appreciation for all that they have done.
Hear, hear.
Since at-home learning began, our government has worked diligently with our education partners to develop our re-entry plan, which will see students return to our schools. Our education system stepped up when in-person classes had to be cancelled. I am certain that they will continue to rise to the occasion, and our students will continue to receive a world-class, high-quality education when they return.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hailstorm last Saturday affected thousands of people and their properties and caused over $1 billion in damages. $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. There is a huge concern in the community that not all losses are insured, and people cannot afford this damage in what has been an extremely challenging year. We are hearing from people who are already being turned away by their insurance broker, and this Premier's only answer is to call them again. Premier, when Fort McMurray flooded, you raced to offer disaster relief funding. Why won't you do the same for my constituents?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's regrettable, truly regrettable, to see the NDP right back at the bottom of the barrel trying to politicize a tragic loss of property. Mr. Speaker, the declaration of an emergency with respect to the Northern Alberta ice jams took technical work for officials to confirm that, and the emergency declaration and funding that followed, I think it was about 2 weeks following the actual onset of the event. We have Emergency Management Agency scientists and technical officials. We hope to get their advice on this matter with respect to Calgary.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Given the MLA for Calgary-Falconridge made embarrassing headlines over concerns about food trucks in his community this week, but has said nothing about the hail damage being faced by tens of thousands of his constituents. That's right, Mr. Speaker. With this government, banning food trucks is a higher priority than fixing people's home. Yeah. And given that the government won't act, and the member for Calgary-Falconridge won't say a word to any member of the government's front bench, do any of you care about residents in Calgary-Falconridge?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, just all I can say, 22 years as a parliamentarian, I have never seen conduct so unbecoming of a member as what we see like that from the NDP almost every single day. The member for Calgary-Falconridge has spent most of the past week working with thousands of his constituents, putting extra hours into his constituency office, staying there in Calgary to help them through the process, to help them with the insurance process, as have the other government members from Calgary Northeast who spoke with me within hours of the crisis happening. They are continuing to do everything they can vigorously to represent their constituents.
Always cautious about members referring to the presence or the absence of a member. The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that the Minister of Community and Social Services, also MLA for Calgary Northeast, has said nothing about disaster relief for her constituents, and given that she has a seat at the cabinet table but apparently no influence over the Premier, to the Minister of Community and Social Services, why won't you stand up to this Premier on behalf of your constituents when they need you the most? There is still real hope that you will do the right thing, will you?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, given that the socialist opposite can't seem to pose a question except by reading it, given that the member opposite's questions always seem to have to involve ad hominem insults and attacks at members, and given the fact that the member for the Minister of Community and Social Services has spent most of the past week working with her constituents to help them through the process, and that this should not be a political item, Mr. Speaker, I invite the member to stop the politics, work with Calgary, work with the residents. Let's all together, across party lines, help the people who were affected.
The honourable member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
Disproportionately negatively impacting women, and so far, the Economic Recovery Mostly Male panel, their MANL, has said nothing about how they're going to centre women's voices for an inclusive recovery that supports all Albertans. And now, 62% of Albertans who are going to be affected by the reversal of the minimum wage are women. Will the Minister of Finance acknowledge that a cut to the minimum wage will hit women the hardest?
The Minister of Status of Women.
For the very important question, Mr. Speaker.
Many, especially women in this province, and I don't know if the member knows this, but out of every 100 male entrepreneurs in this province, 84 are women. In fact, that's the highest average in Canada, the average being 63. This side, and I especially want to thank the Minister of Advanced Education, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism for their incredible work on behalf of not only the women in this province, the entrepreneurs, and all people who are trying to desperately get back to work right now.
Honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Given that the path to an inclusive recovery includes ensuring a fair wage, that's what a real fair deal looks like. And given that for a strong and sustainable economic recovery, the government needs to address economic issues facing women, like unpaid labour and access to affordable, quality childcare. Can the Minister for the Status of Women please tell us how, specifically, she is advocating for the Economic Recovery Panel to truly address the needs of women?
The Honourable, the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you. And again, one of the hugest privileges I have, and we were actually meeting today with Women Building Futures and some of the work that they're doing actually to make sure that women who are entering the workforce right now are going to be in high-paying jobs, which is truly important. But let me say what we're not going to do. We're not going to add on a carbon tax, which disproportionately impacts every single person across this province, or poor economic conditions, or a business environment, or attack the energy sector, the agriculture sector, or the manufacturing sector, which has a tremendous amount of women working in those industries and the ancillary businesses that are built based on those industries.
The Honourable member.
Absolutely, we support high-paying jobs for women as well, but we're talking about the minimum wage right now. Given that cutting the minimum wage will further drive women out of the labour force, and given that Alberta already has the largest gender gap when it comes to labour force participation, to the Minister for Status of Women, again, why do you refuse to speak up for those workers? If you're not going to advocate for the needs of all women now, why are you even here?
The Honourable, the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Well, again, thank you very much to the Minister of Advanced Education for forwarding $10 million into the Women Building Futures, which is actually so much more than just education. It's actually about best practices. It's about building confidence in the industries, which is so important to make sure that women get back to work. And I was going to say that if the member truly cares about women in the workforce, she should probably ask the members on her side why they cut 100,000 jobs in this province, disproportionately impacting women when they were in government.
The Honourable order. The Honourable member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Edmonton is Canada's health city. It's home to numerous post-secondary institutions whose research contributes to a vibrant intellectual community and develops top talent for our province. Edmonton also has valuable institutions like the Stollery Children's Hospital, the Cross Cancer Institute, and the Mazankowski Heart Institute. There have been a climate of commercialization created here in the city with the support of not-for-profits like the Edmonton Economic Development Corporation, Startup Edmonton, and Tech Edmonton, which was ranked as the 4th best university business incubator in North America. To the Minister of Health, what has the province done to help Edmonton become Canada's health city?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. We support the city in promoting the health sciences as an asset to Edmonton and an asset to the province. And the city's reputation in healthcare is built in large part on research, and we're proud to support it. That includes research on COVID-19 detection and surveillance, as well as potential vaccines and treatments. And the Ministry of Health also supports health innovation by providing secure access to key data for research and innovation to improve the system. Thank you.
The Honourable member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is given that the City of Edmonton identified 3 challenges facing the healthcare industry in the city. Those challenges being over-reliance on government funding, lack of access to specialized business resources, and hurdles to technology adoption in the healthcare system. This industry could play a stronger role in creating jobs and growing our economy, especially if we were able to solve those challenges identified by the City of Edmonton. How will the Minister of Health and this government help the City of Edmonton and the rest of the province to rise to meet these challenges and create jobs and develop our economy?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through AHS, we support commercialization in a number of ways. AHS has representatives on the Health City Steering Committee, and they work with the organization to test innovations as part of the process of bringing them to market. They also help guide investments in ideas for system improvement that have commercial potential. And they help secure external sources, I should say, of funding to accelerate the work of the Health City project.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's given that the government has talked about the layers of bureaucracy which is hampering businesses and causing investors not to choose Alberta. This government has made a mandate to reduce unnecessary red tape regulations in an effort to spur this investment, create jobs, and diversify the economy. It's the same minister. Companies in the healthcare space have complained about the regulatory burden they face. What will you do to reduce this red tape burden to encourage growth in this industry?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you. And through the Honourable, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction, we're taking a hard look at how government operates in Alberta, and in health in particular. We're supporting that approach by putting patients at the centre in all of our initiatives, including, for example, our review of continuing care legislation, which began under the chairmanship of the Honourable Member for Calgary Fish Creek. And we'll work with independent partners wherever they can provide a service as well or as better at a lower cost. It's a perfect example of how the NDP really, Mr. Speaker, put ideology at the centre of healthcare and not patients.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 has had devastating effects on our local economy. Businesses were in many cases left with no choice but to close, and if they were able to remain open, they had to alter how they do business. I have heard from many business owners who have been looking to our government for help. To the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism, can you elaborate on what your ministry has been doing to help the many business owners who have experienced a dramatic decrease in revenues?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Our government has introduced the most comprehensive suite of measures to support our job creators among provinces. I've been engaging with businesses on the challenges they've been facing since day one of the pandemic, and we've announced measures ranging from commercial eviction protection to relief from WCB premiums and a deferral of corporate taxes. Bill 23, the Commercial Tendencies Protection Act, is just the latest step to complement the billions of dollars of supports we have already put in place to help businesses of all size.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Given that the federal government created the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program, but tenants can only access the program if their landlords apply, and given that we have heard from many business owners across the province that they are fearing eviction without assistance or protection, and they are looking to our government for help, can the Minister advise what will our government's response be to those business owners who need our help during this difficult time?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the member for the question. I was proud to introduce Bill 23, the Commercial Tendencies Protection Act, after weeks of consultation with thousands of businesses from across Alberta. Bill 23 is a temporary measure that fills many of the gaps of the CECRA program. It protects tenants whose landlords refuse to participate in the program, as well as those who are forced to close or experience a substantial drop in revenue during the pandemic.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Minister. Given that there are many discussion and transactions that have already taken place between tenants and landlords since the state of the public health emergency was first declared in March of this year, to the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism, your legislation will it take any retroactive action for commercial tenants who have been evicted, had lease terminations, been charged late fees, penalties, or experienced a rent increase since the March 17th date laid out in your legislation?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the member for the question. During the development of this legislation, we knew that there were some tenants who needed further protection beyond the support package that we have already provided as we move through relaunch and into economic recovery. We also know that many landlords and tenants are working together and want to work together, but Bill 23 ensures that tenants cannot be charged late fees, penalties, or rent increases until August 31st, and those that have been since March 17th will be reimbursed.
Honourable members, in 30 seconds or less, we will proceed to the introduction of bills.
Introduction of bills.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I request leave to introduce Bill 24, the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020. Bill 24 introduces amendments to 15 acts across 7 different ministries. The amendments are designed to, first, protect public health, second, support our province's reopening, and third, make life easier for Albertans. The state of public health emergency for our province ended on June 15th, 2020. We're proposing to extend some of the measures that were put in place in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As well, we're committing to do a comprehensive review of the Public Health Act with an all-party standing committee. This will mark the first time a comprehensive review of this act has taken place since the Spanish influenza of 1918. Mr. Speaker, Bill 24 will also help ensure that Albertans continue to have access to the services and the supports that they need as our province progresses through relaunch. I look forward to providing more detail on the proposed legislation in the coming days. I hereby move first reading of Bill 24, the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020.
The Honourable the Minister of Health has moved first reading of Bill 24, COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 24, COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020 is now read a first time.
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my privilege to rise today to request leave to introduce Bill 25, the Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020. Mr. Speaker, last fall, this government took decisive action when we proclaimed the Scrap Metal Dealers and Recyclers Identification Act in response to long-standing calls from Albertans and business owners to make it more difficult for criminals to sell stolen metal. Bill 25 builds on those first steps by amending the Act to help deter metal theft, give law enforcement tools to detect it, and ensure meaningful consequences for people and businesses that deal in stolen property. Mr. Speaker, I ask to be moved first reading of Bill 25.
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General has moved first reading of Bill 25, Protecting Albertans from Theft Act 2020. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 25, Protecting Albertans from Theft Act 2020 is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Are there tablings? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the requisite number of copies of a letter and summary of the petition that I referred to in my member statement earlier today. This is from more than 2,000 folks who are connected to the U of A, who are very upset with the closure of the Coots Library in the education building on the U of A campus. The originals were tabled with the University of Alberta, but this is a summary that is here on record for the people of Alberta because, of course, this is as a result of cuts in the UCP budget. Thank you.
Honourable members, are there other tablings today? Seeing none.
Tablings to the clerk, deferred divisions.
Honourable members, it's time for orders of the day, orders du jour.
Under government motions, motion number 25, Honourable Mr. Nixon.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Motion is fairly self-explanatory to set up a all-party committee with the legislature, and I believe it has the support of all members of the House, so let's vote on it.
Honourable members, Government Motion 25 is a debatable motion. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate? Seeing none, I'm prepared to ask the Honourable Government House Leader to close debate. Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Government House Leader, Government Motion 25. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 19, Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
Honourable members, third reading of Bill number 19. Is there anyone wishing? Oh, correction. The Honourable, can he move it on behalf of the Minister? I don't. Okay. The Honourable Minister or Member for Calgary Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly pleased to be able to rise on behalf of the Minister of Health to move third reading of Bill 19, the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act. Before I get into the rest of my speech, I'd like to start off by thanking Albertans and thanking the members of this chamber for the robust discussion and debate. Was certainly honoured to have been a part of that, to have been able to travel from Lethbridge to Fort McMurray, back down to Calgary, up to Red Deer, up to Grand Prairie, and just to be able to meet with so many Albertans and to be able to hear from so many people. I thought that there was a lot of thoughtful feedback and that has informed what I believe is a very balanced bill that will work towards protecting Albertans from the harms of vaping. And again, honored to be a part of that and thankful for the number of Albertans who participated in this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, taking action to further protect Albertans from the harms of tobacco and address the increase in vaping, particularly among young people, is just so important. And I'm honored that our government is delivering on this through this bill. For the past 6 years, we have all witnessed the increase in the number of youth accessing and using vaping products, and that became very clear throughout this review and the concern from so many Albertans for it. In 2014 to 2015, 8% of students in grade 10 through 12 said they vaped within the previous 30 days. By 2018 to 2019, that number rose to 30%, a whopping 30%. 1 in every 3 students. As vaping rates among youth skyrocketed and parents, teachers, and other Albertans started to sound the alarm, the previous government did nothing about it. When I was conducting this review, it was very clear what the depth of the concern was. Visiting a high school up north where the principal told me up to 80% of the kids in her high school were engaging in vaping activities. Meeting with resource officers right here in Edmonton, hearing numbers as high as 60% or more of kids engaging in vaping activities. That actually the 2 resource officers brought in 2 large boxes that they had confiscated within a period of a month and a half and dumped them out on the table in front of us, packed full of vaping products that they had confiscated from youth within their high schools. The concern was great. We heard from youth throughout this review as well, and we had met with one group of youth, I think it was about 40 youth, and I asked the question, how many of you have vaped or know somebody who's vaped within your circle? And every single one of them raised their hand, and every single one of them proceeded to express their deep concern for their classmates and their peers about the impacts of vaping and what they had seen, the impacts of addiction within their classroom and amongst their peers. Youth trusted their government. They do trust their government to be able to put forward things that will help protect them and be able to inform youth. And that's why this legislation, I think, is just so important, because it sends a very strong and clear message to youth that we care about them and that we're working towards protecting them, and that these products themselves are a concern and something that they should be concerned and cautious of. We know that vaping has immediate as well as long-term health risks: lung damage, nicotine poisoning, and addiction. And we've also witnessed the recent emergence in vaping-associated lung illnesses and even deaths right across our country and internationally. We know all of the long-term health consequences. We don't know all of the long-term health consequences of these products. It's a bit of a moving target as we learn more and more research is done. But what we do know is they have health risks. And vaping behavior can model and normalize smoking amongst youth. We heard that very clearly from the youth that we had chatted with. Actually, evidence showed a direct correlation between youth vaping and the increase in use of combustible cigarettes amongst young people. That too is obviously very concerning. Smoking, addiction to tobacco products, is the leading cause of preventable illness and disability and death in Alberta. And Alberta has the 2nd highest rate of smoking in the country. Looking back in 2011-2012, when they first put together the strategy to reduce tobacco use, we saw a steady decline until about 2015. And then we started to see a steady increase in the number of people that were using combustible cigarettes and tobacco products. It was working. And then vaping came on the scene. And that's where, again, I think this bill works towards building upon that initial strategy and trying to get us back on the path of reducing tobacco use in this province. If we don't do something now to reduce these numbers, we are going to see a considerable cost to the health system. More than that, though, we are going to see a devastating cost on individuals, our communities and families, on our youth. In fact, if we don't address this issue now, it is estimated that healthcare costs from smoking alone will be $6 billion over the next 4 years. Currently, Alberta is the only province without legislation to address vaping. And that simply is unacceptable. These proposed amendments to the Smoking and Tobacco Reduction Act, they balance the expectations of Albertans and on the advice of experts and economic interests. Again, with broad consultation across the province, I believe that this bill provides that balance to help make sure that we're taking critical steps forward to protect youth from vaping, to inform Albertans of the impacts of vaping, to give the tools to law enforcement and educators in regards to being able to address the increase in vaping within their communities. But I think it strikes that balance as well in making sure that we're protecting choice for adults and protecting those options for adults, especially adults that are working towards ceasing tobacco use. And we heard loud and clear from Albertans right across the province about the importance and personal anecdotes and stories from Albertans about how these products have helped them to transition from combustible cigarettes and certainly help them feel better. Often when we were meeting with vaping retailers, they were often very much personal mission driven because they had experienced the positive impact of moving from combustible cigarettes. And of course, it is my hope that we can help see people move from combustible cigarettes to not using vaping products in the end. But certainly we want to be able to continue to provide that choice as long as we are informed and see that these products aren't as harmful as combustible cigarettes. I think it's also important to note that this is a moving target and we need to be able to be flexible and continue to monitor this as we move forward. This legislation will allow us to align the purchase of sale, promotion, possession, and consumption of vaping products with current restrictions on tobacco products, including a minimum age of 18 to purchase or possess vaping products. We heard so much from kids just being able to go into stores and seeing the advertisements right there next to Slurpee machines and candy machines and ads online and creating kind of this attractive product. And so this is a huge step. This is one of the biggest things that we heard throughout the review was the importance of removing the visibility of these products to young people and the normalization and just by being there was kind of a statement that this was okay. And so to be able to take these products out of the eyesight of youth is going to be a big, major step. And I think one of the biggest things that we heard, a point of consensus across the board throughout this review process. The amendment further restricts promotion and sale of these products to keep them out of the hands of youth and to support our goal of denormalizing the consumption of tobacco and vaping products. One of the biggest successes in the reduction of combustible cigarettes and their use was, again, working towards denormalizing it. As kids were seeing adults within their community using these products, they went, well, that's okay, and would use that. They looked to us. And so it was important that we took that out of the visibility of their eyesight to help protect them and to send a message that was clear to them that, again, these products are not good for them. More importantly, preventing and reducing the use of tobacco and vaping products will ensure that more Albertans live healthier and longer lives, also reducing the healthcare costs. We heard from Albertans that the availability of flavors is important. And again, when we talked about trying to find balance in this legislation, I think when you take a look at the recommendations that were put forward, we've implemented most, and there was consensus on most actions. We also, by attaching this and combining, or sort of using vaping in regards to matching that with the combustible cigarettes and other tobacco products, we take this a long step forward in regards to our work towards reducing. But it does continue to find that balance in making sure that we are protecting that choice for adults. And flavors were very much an important part of that. You know, as I expressed the other day, and I think it's worth repeating, the concern that if you completely ban flavors for the adults that have been able to make the transition from combustible cigarettes to this product and have been enjoying health impacts from not using combustible cigarettes, there would be an unintended consequence by completely removing this choice from them. And we heard concern that people would end up going back to combustible cigarettes through the process. So I enjoyed the debate, and I certainly appreciated the comments from members across and discussions that I've had throughout this process. And I'd like to say that I did ponder and think heavily on this one and certainly did not move forward with that recommendation easily. But I do believe it was the right decision to move forward at this time. I think it's also important that we continue to monitor this. Again, talking about this being a moving target. And as more and more research comes in on this topic, I think that we need to be able to continue to work together as a community. I don't believe that this is a partisan topic. And again, I've heard the heart from members opposite. I've heard the heart from members of my own caucus here and the concern in the community. Even amongst people who operate vaping retailers and sell these products. Certainly, as we find out more, we need to be able to continue to work together to discuss how we best see a reduction in the use of these products in our province, and to see a reduction in the use of both tobacco and vaping products right across this province. That has to continue to be our goal, and it's certainly my heart to see that happen. Part of that as well is working with the federal government and other provinces. One of the things that we heard throughout this review, and again in a concern in any sort of coming in and quality or product control, is the ease at which this product can move across provincial boundaries, the ease in which this product can move across federal boundaries. And so I think we have to work with our federal counterparts. We have to work with our provincial counterparts to talk about how we would work towards monitoring this product together in a thoughtful way to make sure that, again, we are seeing a reduction of the use of these products, especially amongst youth within our communities. The other thing that I think was worth noting, and we heard it throughout the review, we heard it from the youth, actually, in some of our interviews, was actually the ease in which this product can be made. And a big part of our review, and when you actually take a look at where a lot of the deaths were associated, there was often questions about the quality of the product that was being used or what was being put into that product. So I think it's important that we continue to monitor that as people can make these products within their own basements or their bathroom sinks. The ability to access nicotine online is actually quite simple, and other ingredients for this product. So the ability to continue to sell these products in a safe and monitored way that is removed from the sight of young people, I think is actually part of that concern that I had in regards to just completely removing flavors, and something that I think we have to put thought to as we move forward in regards to this moving forward. So working with the Health Canada, and they obviously have the regulatory authority to further restrict the promotion of flavors. And at this point, they've already done that. I think we heard reference to Rainbow Unicorn a few times throughout the discussion on this issue in the chamber. And obviously, Rainbow Unicorn is not a product that was designed to be appealing to adults. Maybe there's some adults, I won't judge. But it was certainly, we heard from the youth that these were the types of advertisements and names of brands that were appealing to them and appealing to their peers within the classroom. And so I was thankful for the federal government's coming in and dealing with the naming convention, and to be able to reduce or eliminate naming the products in a way that would be appealing to young people. So Bill 19 includes provisions to address flavors in the future, and again, as it's a moving target, we will continue to look at that. This provision gives the government the ability to act quickly to address the role of flavors in attracting youth if need be in the future. And Bill 19, I think, sends a strong message to youth and anyone who thinks it is okay to supply them with vaping products. One of the big things we heard throughout this review is the importance of enforcement and education. Bill 19 is the first legislation in Alberta to address vaping, and it is long overdue. It is a health priority for Albertans and a priority for this government, and I'm thankful for that. I think this is also worth noting that this is only part of the solution. Obviously, getting this legislation across the line is a big part of the solution, but we have to make sure that we're focused on enforcement. We have to make sure that we're working towards educating our youth, our parents. I've actually heard stories where parents were going into vaping retailers to try to purchase these products for their youth, and the vaping retailers would work towards educating the parents on the health harms. Actually, in often the cases, the vaping retailers were actually asking for this legislation to give them the tools to be able to help protect youth in their communities. And then lastly, making sure that there's addiction supports in place, as we now have a large number of youth within our community that are nicotine addicted and will need support in addressing those addictions. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, I am proud to move third reading of Bill 19, the Tobacco Smoking Reduction Amendment Act. And with that, I'd like to adjourn debate.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Having heard the motion by the Honourable Member for Calgary, Klein, all those in favour of the motion to adjourn debate, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried.
Under government motions, motion number 24, the Honourable Mr. Kinney.
The Honourable Premier to move government motion number 24.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move government motion 24. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly condemns racism and all forms of bigotry and hatred, affirms the commitment of Alberta to human dignity and equality of all before the law, acknowledges the pernicious and durable nature of anti-Black racism, acknowledges a tragic history of racism directed at Indigenous people in Canada, and urges the government to consider these issues in its ongoing review of the Police Act. May I proceed, Mr. Speaker? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to rise and debate on these critically important issues. Mr. Speaker, the recent and brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, in the United States, has been a catalyst for a necessary and I hope cathartic public debate throughout the United States, across Canada, and the entire world, which I hope will lead to a real change in hearts, minds, and institutions. Let us say clearly and with one voice in this place, Mr. Speaker, that racism is always and everywhere an unqualified evil. It is a sickness of the soul. It is a stain on humanity. It must be condemned at every turn. And we must recognize our own sad history of institutional racism here in Canada and indeed here in Alberta. Racism has touched too many Albertans. Too many Albertans continue to experience racial prejudice in their lives. And Mr. Speaker, it is important for those of us who are elected to represent Albertans to say these things and to reflect them in our attitudes and in our actions. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we seek to build here in Alberta is a society that is rooted in a belief in the inalienable dignity of the human person, a belief in equality of all before the law, and a belief in real, lived, actual equality of opportunity. And that cannot exist as long as there are attitudes of racial prejudice which judge people, which undermine the lives of people, which at its worst inflict violence upon people because of the color of their skin, of their racial or ethnic origin, of their place of birth, or other immutable characteristics. Mr. Speaker, while we acknowledge these things, let us also acknowledge that Albertans and Canadians have built one of the most welcoming, tolerant societies in human history, imperfect though it may be. While much work must yet be done, it does not diminish the challenge or reality of racism in our society to also acknowledge that we have built a society which people from every corner of the world dream of, strive to join as new Albertans and as new Canadians. And we should take some comfort in that. we should acknowledge that while our friends to the south in the United States of America continue to struggle with the terrible historical burden of racism because of the institution of slavery, and while we should acknowledge that slavery did exist in some parts of Canada, we should also celebrate the fact that in 1793, Upper Canada, now Ontario, was one of the first jurisdictions on the face of the earth to make slavery illegal, which is why Canada became, long before Confederation, the northern star for the escaped slaves seeking freedom through the Underground Railroad. We should think of all of those heroes who joined with the abolitionists in the United States to make this a country of freedom and of liberation. We acknowledge at the same time that those who heroically engaged in the battle of abolition in Canada, the United States, that notwithstanding their efforts, many of the escaped slaves who came north continued to face racism and prejudice here. For example, those black loyalists who came to the colony of Nova Scotia at the end of the American Revolutionary War, only to face institutional racism in that colony, many of whom then fled back to West Africa, to Liberia, to complete the circle of their family's tragic migration. And so, while we should acknowledge the nobility of many in Canadian history who turned Canada into a land of liberation and opportunity, we should never allow those noble moments in our history to minimize or diminish the long history of institutional racism which has existed. So this very same country, which was the North Star for the Underground Railroad for escaped slaves coming north from the United States in the 19th century, the very same country in 1910, under the premiership of Sir Wilfrid Laurier, had a prime minister who signed a ministerial order barring black people from migrating to Canada. The very same country that in 1885, following the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, said to the thousands of Chinese railway laborers that effectively they were no longer welcome in Canada by imposing the head tax, which was a punitive racial charge for people of Chinese origin to migrate to or stay in Canada. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, the same Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who imposed that order banning people of African descent from entering Canada, also increased by tenfold the shameful Chinese head tax from $50 per person to a massively prohibitive $500 per person in 1912. So our own history, we must recognize it is a complex one. It's a history filled with noble characters who overcame prejudice, who fought for emancipation, who created equality before the law, but it's also a history of often systemic and institutional racism. And not far off in our past, Mr. Speaker, we as Canadians are still coming to terms with the terrible devastation of our Indigenous communities through the regime of Indian residential schools, where children were torn away from their parents, where families were destroyed by the abusive power of the state in an effort to completely deracinate Indigenous children from their families, their languages, and their cultures. To deracinate means literally to pull up out of their roots. We must acknowledge that at the heart of that policy, and while there certainly were people who were well-intentioned in offering an education in the context of residential schools, and there were as has been testified by many Aboriginal residential school survivors, there were many good people working in that system, that the system fundamentally was flawed. The system was fundamentally racist in its nature and was an official policy of the Government of Canada, supported as well by the Government of Alberta, other provincial governments, and institutions of civil society. And so we must acknowledge that just as the vestiges of slavery in the United States continues to reverberate down to this day, so too does the racism that lied at the heart of the residential schools continue to reverberate through Indigenous communities to our own time. And so, Mr. Speaker, I can understand the response of many Canadians in the context of the current debate, saying we live in a society characterized by equality, respect for minority rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, access to the courts, programs to educate and support people of minority backgrounds. So there is an element in this discourse that says we don't have racism. We should, that basically seeks to deny it. I think that is a terrible mistake, Mr. Speaker. It is a terrible mistake to deny the lived reality and the real experience of our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, so many of whom can speak to the reality of racism, both explicit and implicit, in their lives. Mr. Speaker, I had the great privilege of serving as Canada's longest ever serving Minister of Citizenship and Immigration for over 5 years, during which time I welcomed more newcomers to Canada than any immigration minister in the history of the Dominion. And for 9 years, had the honor of working with our ethnocultural communities as the Canadian Minister for Multiculturalism. And through that lens, I got to hear thousands of stories and develop hundreds of friendships with people from diverse racial and religious backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, and to hear their experiences. Very often what they would tell me, Mr. Speaker, is that the racism that they encountered was not overt, it wasn't explicit, or it wasn't official. But very often it was insidious, somewhat hidden, and implicit. It would be expressed, for example, in their never getting a call back on interviews, on applications that they made for employment, time after time after time, even if they were manifestly better qualified than the person selected for the job. It was manifest, I would argue, in some ways, by the enormous regulatory barriers that exist to the recognition of the qualifications, education, and credentials of newcomers, who often have to take high levels of education from abroad and go to the bottom of the Canadian labour market, working well below their skill level because our institutions are too rigid to recognize in a fair and just way their education skills and education. Of course, we can see this as well, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, and too often, in our criminal justice system, this is something with which we must grapple. It is true, for example, that we have a massively disproportionate presence in our correctional system of Canadians of Indigenous origin. And we have all seen complaints of brutality or targeting of people from racial minority and Indigenous backgrounds. We must take those seriously, and our institutions, our laws, our policies, our regulations must constantly be reviewed to ensure that they actually do reflect our highest belief in equality of all before the law. That is, for example, one of the reasons why, Mr. Speaker, the government of Alberta is currently engaged in a fundamental review of the Police Act. And we invite Albertans of all backgrounds, particularly those who may have been victims of or have first-hand experience of racist attitudes in our policing or correctional or justice systems, we invite them to come forward to share those experiences and to propose remedies to be reflected in the law. We owe them nothing less than that, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I've always been of the view that racism and hatred really is, as I said, a sickness of the soul. And I believe that it's very challenging to change someone's heart. That can't be done through a conventional government program. Posters and public awareness campaigns cannot take hate out of someone's heart. I think the most powerful way of rooting hatred out of people who may have been raised or developed such attitudes is through the power of relationships. It's by getting to know others beyond the racial, ethnic, or religious stereotypes. That's what I learned as the Canadian Minister for Multiculturalism, the power of those relationships. That's why I think it's so critically important, Mr. Speaker, that as we talk about diversity being a strength, we must constantly strive not for diversity as an end, but rather we should strive for unity in our diversity. We must be intentional about not creating a series of cultural or racial or religious silos operating side by side. We must, through government policies, through our own intentions, through our conduct as individual citizens, make a very deliberate effort to build bridges of understanding. I was responsible as Minister for Multiculturalism for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which was established by the Mulroney government as part of the redress settlement with the Japanese-Canadian community to express the profound regret of the Government of Canada for its role in the detention and internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. And I always thought the Canadian Race Relations Foundation was a very wise framing of the issue to develop those relationships. Some say what we need is not multiculturalism, but interculturalism. Whatever the appellation is, Mr. Speaker, I think the greatest antidote to the poison of hatred is the personal relationships that we must build in our society. That's why when I was the federal multiculturalism minister, I made a point of changing our grants and funding programs to focus on programs that would bring people together. Because, Mr. Speaker, let's speak bluntly. Racism, while there is a long and tragic history of it in this country, as I've reflected on, sadly, sometimes people come to Canada from, as newcomers from regions or countries where there is a history of conflict. And sometimes, because of the injustices they've suffered, the grievances that they've experienced, there are enmities from that come to Canada. I'll share an example. When I recall, I think in 2006, shortly after becoming minister responsible for multiculturalism, there was a Sinhalese, a Buddhist monastery that had been firebombed in Scarborough, Ontario, and ultimately the perpetrators were brought to justice, and it was discovered that they were people from a different confessional community from the same country of origin who, in a sense, were living out the conflict of the country from which they came, much like my Irish ancestors had done in the 19th century. The biggest conflict in Upper Canada in the 19th century was the Orange versus the Green, the Catholics versus the Protestants, the Republicans versus the Loyalists. And they continued to live out in many ways here in Canada the conflicts that they had brought. Conflicts that were rooted in hatred, in confessional hatred. And in some cases, these conflicts arrive and are expressed in the form of racial hatred. And my point is simply this, that whatever the form that hatred or racism takes, I think the critical remedy is to find common ground to bring people together, to get to know each other as human beings, as women and men who I believe as a person of faith are ultimately creatures of God. equal in dignity before God. And, Mr. Speaker, that is not an easy thing to do. We can and should put up the posters and the public awareness campaigns and information in the school curriculum about the terrible evil of racism, but ultimately, we must avoid the kind of centrifugal forces that would pull us apart into cultural, religious, or racial silos. And that is an ongoing challenge for all of us, to which there is no easy programmatic answer. I guess that's my point, Mr. Speaker. But we all must make an effort. Government must make an effort. I hope I'm not stepping outside of cabinet confidence to say that my esteemed colleague, the Minister of Municipal Affairs, raised in a forum here recently the lack of diversity in the Alberta Public Service management in the senior levels, and challenged the government to do better, and he was absolutely right to do so. And so, Mr. Speaker, in every institution, these are the kinds of things upon which we must constantly reflect. I would encourage all members in their offices to be mindful of this, to make an effort wherever possible to hire people, give opportunities to people, and of course based on merit and competence, but wherever possible to try to create a culture of inclusion where the institutions for which we are partly responsible reflect the diversity of today's Alberta. These are the challenges that face us, Mr. Speaker. And I want to come back, however, to perhaps the harder challenges that we face that have come to light about issues around policing and corrections in the justice system. Mr. Speaker, the model of our justice system is one where the goddess of justice is blindfolded to ensure her impartiality. And that is the model to which we strive. But we must acknowledge that sometimes there are even unconscious prejudices that have built up around people because of their racial or ethnic origin or other characteristics. And we must ensure through our courts, our Crown Prosecutor Service, our police services, our correction services, and all responsible for the administration of justice, that justice truly is blind. Because I hope that we can all share the sentiment of the great Martin Luther King, that we must judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Mr. Speaker, I want to close my remarks by reflecting on a remarkable Alberta story that I think is a hopeful one. Because in this debate, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's helpful for us individually or collectively to paint our society or our institutions as deeply and irreparably racist. I think actually those characterizations, unintentionally, they undermine getting public support for combating racism where it does exist. Mr. Speaker, we must avoid the temptation of denialism, and we must avoid the tendency to racialize everything. I think the vast majority of Albertans live peaceably with their neighbors of all backgrounds, respecting their dignity and their diversity. Sadly, that is not universally the case. And so, as I say, more work must be done, individually and institutionally. But we must also recognize a certain greatness in our history. I close with this, the story of John Ware. John Ware was born into slavery in South Carolina in the 1860s, prior to the Civil War. following emancipation by the great liberator, Abraham Lincoln, John Ware moved west and became a cowpoke on a ranch in Texas. You can imagine a ranch in Texas must have been a pretty tough place for anybody, but especially for a black man who had escaped slavery in the 1860s in West Texas. He was a tough dude, Mr. Speaker, and he became known as one of the most respected and capable cowpokes in the entire American West. Well, as you know, Mr. Speaker, in the 1880s, that's when we started to see the great cattle drives of thousands and thousands of cattle owned by U.S. ranchers, and they would just swing them up along the path of where the buffalo used to roam in the Great Plains. And John was hired by his rancher to be part of a huge cattle drive, one of the largest in history, in 1882, that brought 20,000 cattle up here to graze on the Canadian prairie, on the Alberta plains, and on the eastern slopes of our magnificent Rocky Mountains. John decided he loved this land so much, he was going to make it his new home. He befriended local indigenous communities, befriended local ranchers, got hired onto a ranch. John obviously, you can imagine, in the 1880s, out here in the New West, he continued to face racism. But, Mr. Speaker, he never allowed it to become a reason to stop overcoming that racism. He always saw those obstacles as a motivation to prove himself as being the best cowboy on the plains. And he did. In fact, he invented the sport of bonkbrucking, which is now part of the rodeo circuit, of course, at the Calgary Stampede and all around North America. John Ware was the creator of that amazing and rugged sport. John became known as the greatest cowboy of the plains, the greatest cowboy in Alberta and Canadian history. And he was one of the only black cowboys in our early Canadian history. What amazing strength of character. A man born into slavery who went to the freest part of the free world, the open plains, and in a way reinvented his life, having left behind the terrible scars of racism from South Carolina to create a new life for him and his family. He married a pastor's daughter in Calgary, and they had 3 beautiful daughters. Eventually, he bought his own plot of land out south of Brooks, his own ranch. But tragically, John was out tending to his cattle on that ranch on September the 12th, 1905. And his horse hit a gopher hole, he tumbled, horse fell on him, and John was tragically killed. Just a year after buying his own ranch, the culmination of his dreams, a father of 3. They took John Ware's body into Calgary, Mr. Speaker. And the largest funeral in the history of the Northwest Territories occurred. Tens of thousands of residents came from far and wide to 8th Avenue in Calgary. They were 10 deep on both sides to watch John Ware's coffin pass through that crowd of that frontier, tough cowboy town 140 years ago. In a culture, in a society still deeply embedded with racial prejudice, they saw the dignity of John Ware. They saw a man who had overcome slavery to become a true exemplar of freedom. So, Mr. Speaker, let us all be inspired by the example of John Ware, who changed hearts and who was a living example of the truest and deepest Alberta belief in human dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Are there any honourable members wishing to join debate? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Meadows has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and have the opportunity to add some of the comments to the motion, government motion 24. In the starting, I have actually amendment to the motion. If I can read or wait for the... Yeah, that's it. Oh, you need these. Sorry.
And just a reminder with regards to the process on this amendment A1, if you put up your hands if you want a copy of it, it can be delivered. There will also be copies left on the tables to both sides here. And if the honourable member for Edmonton Meadows could please read it into the record and continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move this amendment to the motion 24 be amended by striking out clause E and substituting the following. E urges the government to ensure that these issues and the voices of racialized communities are considered in its ongoing review of the Police Act by immediately establishing an advisory panel. Number one, to conduct a hearing throughout the province to examine and make recommendations in respect of systemic racism in Alberta. Number two, that consists of member of the Anti-Racism Advisory Council, Provincial Indigenous leadership, and Black Lives Matter chapters of Alberta. And number three, to publish a report with its findings and recommendations no later than October 1st, 2020.
Continue with about 18 and a half minutes remaining on your time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, it's my pleasure to rise and add my comments and experiences to this very important issue. Mr. Speaker, racism is real. The people of color, Indigenous communities, the Black people, they have been facing this for centuries. And as of today, as we speak, in the House, and those very communities, people, they are still facing racism and discriminations. This racism and discrimination has done historic damage to generations of these communities. When someone really faces the discrimination or experience the racism, it is not just only with the person that impact him negatively. It is the generations after generations. You will see the impact. Their next generations, their kids, they are impacted by the person who really face these challenges in their lives. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to say it was so unfortunate that people like George Floyd have to give their life, sacrifice, or the people like Chief Alan Adam have to experience this in order for us to come together in this House and talk about this issue that is so serious to them. in this House. And I appreciate the government took some steps, and I appreciate the Premier just moved the motion in this House. But same time, I have some concerns. A few days ago, I asked for the unanimous consent in this House on this motion, on this issue, but I was not granted that. And it was yesterday, through the question answers, I proposed my support and my caucus support. If we can sit with government, if we can sit with the people, that we can help strengthening the motion coming forward as we are debating this motion. So unfortunately, that didn't go very far. That got ignored. And what we are hearing, I appreciate the government is moving to address the issue of racism on ongoing review of Police Act. But my concern is this enough to address the systemic racism in all the institutions in our province that exist today? So that is why I have presented the amendment today, the same motion that I asked for the unanimous consent and asked the government members and members of this House. This is the time not only to condemn. I appreciate the government, House, and the Premier stood up in the House. He condemned it today. And even though it took a little longer, but at least he stood up, he condemned it. And it is not enough. This is a time to take action. We saw those people outside the legislature, people in Calgary, hundreds of thousands of people across this province, in this country, within North America and around the world. The issue is so, important and impacting badly those communities. This is a time actually to take some actions. We can assure those people that we are here to not only to listen to them, to make sure that we will move forward to end the systemic racism, at least in this province. So when we were in the government, I was not part of the government, the NDP government in last 4 years, did some work, consulted the people. With that long consultation, they came up with some plans. They established the Anti-Racism Advisory Council. That was the proposal of Anti-Racism Advisory Council was to advise the ministry how to evaluate the action plans against anti-racism. The plans, they are outlined in taking action against racism plan. So I also established a community grant program to fund groups. Those groups, they were working directly to targeting racism and raising the awareness of different cultures. Not only that, we invested into education. We invested into healthcare. Some of the tasks that Take Action Against Racism report included were starting career mentorship program to smaller cities, creating a provincial hate crime unit, funding the Alberta hate crime committees, upgrading the curriculum to include materials focused on fighting racism. expanding the number of languages students can learn in, making sure Albertans know their rights, making it easier for Albertans to have access to anti-racism resources we need. So those were some of the steps. And we also launched $25 child care pilot program. And that program further encouraged the development of a community-led flex care directly impacted to Black, Indigenous, and people of color families. And the biggest achievement, I would say, our government, the focused on the children. 50% of the child poverty was reduced in those 4 years. And helping marginalized communities, the minimum wage was brought up to $15 per hour. So if we are serious about this, if we really wanted to do something to end racism, end systemic racism from our institutions, we need to take actions. But I have seen that in today's motion, we are not that serious about it, or it lacks the action that actually we need to take if we are committed to end racism, systemic racism from our provincial institutions. Some of the other programs in this one whole year I specifically wanted to stress on is this. We have moved actually backward on those things. Instead of when this issue is so prevalent and it came on the forefront by the 2 incidents, but in reality in Alberta we have moved backward by not actually funding the Anti-Racism Council. They are still waiting for the directions. For the last 6 months, I would say, they didn't have a meeting. And they are still waiting for the directions they can contribute in this province and help this government to combat systemic racism. The UCP government somehow, I see, do not really value the investments into the program. And instead of investing in more programs, I've seen in that past 4 years the cuts going on the programs they already existed. They were helping the communities or the community organizations to work in the province to combat racism and bring awareness. These were the programs, Human Rights Education Fund, Anti-Racism Community Group Program. So they have been terminated. If we are serious about this, if we are serious to end the discrimination, if we are serious to end the systemic racism that the Premier spoke about, the communities of this province have been experiencing historically and doing a damage to their generations to come, not only these generations. We've got to do a lot more. So that is the reason I moved. This is not even a lot. That task force we have recommended in our amendment would only start the work to hearing round, to listening people. That doesn't even go too far. That is just first step to get on. To conduct hearing, listen people, but yes, they will have a timeline. they will have their work done and they will have the recommendations back to this House no later than October 1st of this year. And this is the way, if we do not have action, these will be only talking points, and talking points will not go very far, and they will not serve anything. We are committed to tackle this systemic racism in this province. And also, it cannot be really, I understand, I was amazed by the speech the Premier gave today and the history he shared. But unfortunately, the statements and the statement from the officers are not going to do much. And it has been proven in the past. We need to get out and talk to those people who are living with this experience and have the channel, the panel, the people. They can bring those experiences and recommendations and their professional advice so we can move forward to combat the racism in Alberta. And I urge this Assembly to show their commitment to meaningful action by voting in favor of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika has risen to join debate on A1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have enjoyed the early stages of this debate on this motion against the societal perversions that is racism. I expect more robust and fulsome discussion going forward, but at this time, I move that we adjourn debate.
Having heard the motion to adjourn debate by the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika, does the Assembly agree with the motion? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. I see the Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the legislative week draws to the end, through you to all members, I thank all members for their hard work this week and move that we adjourn the House until June 22nd at 1:30 p.m. and wish everybody safe travels home.
The Honourable Government House Leader has moved that the Assembly adjourn until Monday afternoon at 1:30 p.m. Does the Assembly agree? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. We are adjourned.